Just to sort of set the scene, unlike a lot of the other funds that we've been talking about, hedge funds, private equity isn't necessarily an offshore product completely. We estimate that about 70% of all private equity funds are domiciled in places like the UK, the US, etc. That there is not a need, a definitive need for all private equity funds to be serviced or to be domiciled offshore. So there is an increasing amount of pressure from large institutional investors to look towards the more regulated domiciles in terms of structures.
Luxembourg basically has been active in private equity for probably around 20 to 25 years.
Okay.
And it started as a place for international acquisition structuring, and I guess that most, at least of those in the room, are perfectly familiar with this, which is that especially US funds investing in Germany and in France would do their acquisitions through Luxembourg using Luxembourg SOPA fee structures.
Private equity community traditionally uses UK, US, Cayman, Guernsey, Luxembourg sort of domiciles. There are a lot of French domiciled private equity funds in terms of FCPs. So each of the domestic markets have their own domestic fund structures. And then there are the offshore environments. The Middle East, for instance, often uses Cayman as a domicile for private equity structures. But you're absolutely right. There is no sort of large pressure to suddenly think, oh, you know, should we be moving from Guernsey to Luxembourg? Should we be moving from Cayman to elsewhere? They're long-term funds. They're locked-up funds. So those funds have acquired their investors, and they are not going out and seeking new investors. It's the next fund.
The existing funds, they do not. There is no reason for the existing funds to redomicile, except if it is maybe a fund which is in the very starting phase of a fund which has been very recently raised and where AFM would, and which has basically not yet completed its fundraising, where there is a second closing, a third closing, but that's done really exceptional. I fully agree with David. So it's the new funds. So they can choose their first domicile to be Luxembourg, to be Guernsey, to be Jersey. But if you are, but I think the private equity world is really watching it, and they will probably, we will not expect that there is a big movement before the IFM directive becomes clearer. The transparency requirements, whether we like it or not, it's achievable. It's not something which is unachievable. We are doing it anyway because we have the pressure from the investors, and so many do not see the IFM directive as the biggest problem they have currently on their agenda. Biggest problem being more to refinance their companies. I mean, in Europe there are around 700 billion which needs to be refinanced over the next years. That's an enormous amount of money. So the focus is more on that side of issues than the IFM directive would be mine.
I think there are substantial political pressures within private equity. I haven't yet been, I don't fortunately have to go to many hedge fund conferences these days, but I don't know whether it's happened, but certainly private equity conferences over the last 2 years have actually had trade unions marching up and down outside the conference hall, complaining about private equity and the way that private equity potentially, in the eyes of the trades unions, runs companies. So it has been a very political animal. In terms of an organisation, we're not in a position to be able to sort of put people on the ground and premises and all that sort of thing, waiting for the legislation to change. You have to wait for the legislation to change and people to start to use it. And then as a business, you then start to move into the domicile. And we started that process really before the AIFM discussion itself started. We watched Luxembourg as a domicile for 2 or 3 years. I kept a very close watch on it, watched how the legislation had changed, and then strategically we said, this legislation is right, people are starting to use it, We are particularly focused on servicing the private equity sector. We need to be there.
And I think the tendency will be that there will be smaller funds, because limited partners are less and less prepared to invest in the mega funds. They are looking at specialized private equity houses which go into niche markets. And you could look at phenomena like the Volcker rule in the US, where banks will need to take off their private equity off the balance sheet. So you will have spin-offs which will go probably in a number of smaller funds. And I think that Luxembourg is well positioned to attract these type of funds. I must say, I would not say that by the end of this year there will be a lot of large mega funds which will domicile in Luxembourg. That might happen, but not over the short term. However, the IFM remains a question mark, because if you can basically, after the IFM, go into the European markets through the private placement regime, that means circumventing the IFM directive, then it's less sure that Luxembourg will gain in private equity, because the private equity people will just avoid the IFM directive. But if that will not happen, then I would say that will be an additional trigger for Luxembourg. 2010
will be reasonably busy with some fund launches, reasonable levels of activity of new funds coming along. I believe that Luxembourg will increase its share. I'm not going to put numbers on it, but it will be increasing its share. But I also believe that in 12 months' time we might be talking about some new locations and domiciles that we're not even considering.